For the past several months, I've been using a Raspberry Pi 3B plus 1GB model for my retro gaming console using RetroPie, which has been great, but unfortunately there are some drawbacks to using a Raspberry Pi, namely the kind of consoles that you can emulate within. Okay, typically when people say retro gaming, they're referring to the Mario Bros. And Zelda games and Street Fighter games of the 80s and 90s. But I think you leave a lot on the table if you exclude some of the consoles that maybe aren't quite as retro, but are still very classic, like N64 and GameCube and Wii and Dreamcast and PSP and even PS2. And while not super retro per se, I think all of these consoles are very classic, and for their time, they were pioneering new graphic techniques, they were pioneering new styles of games, and they've been well outdated for at least a decade now. And so I think you can include those on your retro gaming list, but unfortunately you can't play those on a Raspberry Pi, at least not a very cheap one anyway. So I decided I would set out to build the ultimate retro gaming PC console emulator on a budget, right? And so to get started, you're gonna need an older PC, but a good PC. In the last year or so, there have been a bunch of PCs that have come on the market that are old but good and that are definitely at an awesome price point. I decided I was going to be using the ThinkCentre M93P SFF model by Lenovo, which has a quad-core i5-4570. In total, it cost me about $140. And I went with the SFF model because it has just the i5-4570 as opposed to the 4570T, which is a lower power processor, and I thought to myself, maybe I can get a little bit more of a boost in my games if I use that processor specifically in that computer. Looking back on it though, I don't think it gave me the boost that I was hoping for, and I probably would have just gone with the mini model instead of the SFF model. So next, once you get your PC, you're gonna need some peripherals. And I decided I would just grab 4 wireless PS4 controllers with 2.4 gigahertz receivers off of Amazon, but unfortunately that didn't work out because those receivers kept confusing which controllers were which, and my PC model doesn't have a Wi-Fi or Bluetooth module, so I couldn't use Bluetooth controllers anyway. So alas, I ended up going with 4 VoiE Xbox controllers, which I prefer the Xbox layout anyway, and these controllers are definitely really good for the price. They were $15 each, and I was able to get 4 of them for a total of $60. Now, having wired controllers does put me at a little bit of a disadvantage because it means that I can't be sitting across the room while my PC is tucked behind my TV, which was my original plan, is I wanted to have the PC tucked behind the TV. I'm sitting on my couch across the room and I'm gaming, right? And that would be the ideal situation. And now what I have to do, because I have wired controllers, is I have to use an extra long HDMI cable, some extension cords for the power cord, and then I have to put the PC in the middle of the room so the cords can now reach my couch while I'm sitting on it. Definitely far from ideal, but that is an issue that I will resolve later on down the road instead of right now, because I'm just trying to make sure that the emulator works. Now that you have your controllers, you're also going to want a handheld keyboard of sorts so you can sit across the room and you can use it as a normal PC, but with a handheld keyboard instead of trying to figure out a mouse and a full-size keyboard. So I just went on Amazon, found a really cheap one with lots of reviews, and I just bought that one. And now that you've got your hardware figured out, you're going to need an operating system. Generally speaking, Windows and I aren't on very good terms, and so I decided to not go with Windows and go with Ubuntu instead, because I really like how the Ubuntu operating system functions. But theoretically speaking, this should work just fine on Windows and Mac as well. So if you wanted to get an old Mac Mini and run this thing off of that, you probably would do just fine. So I grabbed a USB drive and I flashed Ubuntu OS on there and then installed it onto the computer. So once you have Ubuntu installed, or your operating system of choice, you're going to need to download your emulators. I'm going to be using RetroArch for everything up to about GameCube/PSP. So I'm going to use it for all of the old classic Nintendo systems, including N64. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to download PPSSPP separately, as well as the Dolphin emulator, which will emulate my GameCube and Wii games. And then finally, PCSX2, which will run my PlayStation 2 games. Now, this system as well as most PCs in this price range, will handle N64 and Dreamcast games absolutely no problem. The question is, will it handle PSP games, PS2 games, and Wii games, and maybe GameCube games, depending on the GameCube game. Now, I was an Xbox kid growing up, so I didn't actually play a lot of games put out by Sony and Wii exclusively for their consoles, but I did play a lot of crossovers, and when I was at friends' houses when I was a kid, I would also play on their systems because they always had PS2s and Nintendo systems and whatnot. So I would play it when I was over there, but I didn't play a lot of those games specifically. So I'm going to test out a lot of crossover games as well as the few that I picked up along the way. So I started out with PSP and I decided to test Marvel Ultimate Alliance, which may not be the most graphically intense game, but it was one I liked a lot when I was a kid and when it was a thing. I upscaled the resolution to 4x, which was super cool because it ran no problem at all as far as the gameplay goes. Now, there was an error as far as the cutscenes went. Like, the cutscenes wouldn't play properly. Occasionally they would flash the correct cutscene on the screen, but generally speaking, you wouldn't get the cutscenes. But I don't know if that's a PPS SPP problem, if it's a PC problem, or if it's a ROM problem. And so the gameplay was fine, it was just the cutscenes that were off, so I decided not to fault the emulator or the PC for that problem, and hopefully it's just the ROM. For PS2, I decided to test Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers, which was a classic game that I played a lot on Xbox. To this day, it's literally one of my favorite games of all time. This game was super slow at first. It was just super laggy. It was not only going at, low frames, but it was also just going at like half speed, which was just totally unplayable. But I found that I could fix the problem by toggling the hardware-software renderer with F9 on my keyboard. And once I did that, the game ran really smooth. And this is kind of a nuisance because in other games, some of the in-game text would be missing if I toggled it on one of the settings, and that makes the game lag. And so throughout the game, I would have to toggle it on and off in order to get the text or to get the game playing at full speed. And I just don't think that's a really great experience. And this is actually why, if I were to go back and repurchase the Think Center, I would get the mini version instead of the SFF model, because I don't feel like I got much of a boost here having the SFF model as opposed to the mini one. And I would have saved money and space with the mini one. So I think if I were to go back, I would definitely get the mini model instead of the SFF model. But it is bearable, and I was okay playing it, and I ended up beating the game, and I really enjoyed it. So it's okay for me. Now, for Wii, I tested Mario Galaxy, which was actually a really lame game to test out using an Xbox controller because it uses the nunchuck of the Wii remote quite heavily. So although it ran no problem at all, I'm not going to be playing it much because the nunchuck just sits in the middle of the screen, and that sucks. So I also tested out Looney Tunes Space Race on Dreamcast just in case, and it ran just fine as I assumed. Now, the game itself was slow, but I also remember it being slow when I was a kid, and I think that's more of a Dreamcast thing and a game thing. So, it ran probably faster than I remember it on the Dreamcast itself. And then finally, I ran a GameCube game just to make sure that everything ran fine, and I downloaded Super Smash Bros. Melee, because honestly, you can never have too much Melee, and it ran perfectly, no hiccup, flawless, and I ended up playing way too much Super Smash. So there you have it. It's the ultimate gaming emulator, and all in it cost me about $200. So is it worth it? I'd say yeah. There are a bunch of classic games in addition to all of the super retro games that now I can play, and it only cost about $100 more than what a Raspberry Pi would do. Only now it's capable of so much more. In fact, I can even do some light work because I have the portable keyboard and mouse. I can do some of my marketing work that I do for my day job. I can peruse YouTube, and I can do all of the things that a normal computer would do because the computer itself is actually a pretty decent model. And so yeah, I think it's worth the $200 to create this emulator system that can run all of these games. I'm a big fan. Now, I don't like pulling it out into the middle of the floor, and that's something that I'm gonna have to figure out how to deal because I have these wired controllers, but that's something I'll solve in a later video. And I feel like I'm playing something in the past 20 years, right? Because I got these wired controllers, but that's also kind of the point, so it makes sense. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. In future videos, I'll be looking at fixing the problem with the wired controllers and how to make sure it's not in the middle of the room. I'll also be looking at putting the SFF model inside a smaller form factor case and getting rid of the CD drive. And then I'll also look at the reviews of these specific controllers and this keyboard and mouse that I used as well. So be sure to stick around for those videos as well. Thank you so much for watching.